So take it away, Carol Watson-Williams.
Hi, good afternoon. Well, where I am, it's afternoon, but good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to present the results of this study that we worked over a period of time, collaborating with ECADE. So I'm glad that we're at this point where we can share the results and the findings. So I'm hope that I do. So I'm going to share my screen and move right into the presentation. And I'm really looking forward to a very vibrant discussion at the end. What am I doing? Slideshow. All right. I just move across. So basically, this is how, oops. Okay, back, oops, gone wrong already. This is how I've set up the presentation, just a little introduction, looking at intimate partner violence, what were the objectives of this particular study, some of the methodology we used to implement the study, and the findings, conclusions, and recommendations. So we know, because many of us here have done work on violence against women and girls in particular, but in there's a subset focused on intimate partner violence. So we know that intimate partner violence is one of the most common and pervasive forms of gender-based violence across the world. And the definition that we used for this particular study was that IPV is behavior by an intimate partner or an ex-partner that causes physical, sexual, or psychological harm. So it includes physical aggression, sexual coercion, psychological abuse, and controlling behaviors. And there are definitions that also include economic abuse, but some of them sort of stretch the psychological abuse definition to embody the economic abuse as well. But I think we did ask about economic abuse in this particular study as well. So it may be perpetrated by men towards women, women towards men, and persons in same-sex relationships. So although a lot of the work that has been done in the Caribbean so far focuses on IPV in heterosexual relationship, particularly as on men as perpetrators, this particular study sort of pushes the work one step further, because all the prevalent surveys that have been done on intimate partner violence and violence against women and girls have all focused so far in the Caribbean. The WHO methodology that we have implemented in the region, all of those have focused on heterosexual relationships. So although we don't have we don't have localized surveys beyond this one, perhaps, on IPV in same-sex relationships and in the LGBTQ community. Globally, there's data that tells us that at least 1 in 10 LGBTQ women and trans masculine persons have been victims of sexual assault by a same-sex partner. 2 in 10, that's about 20% in some countries, and in others, 1 in 3 had experienced physical assault over their lifetime. Almost 40% of men who have sex with men in the OECS have been physically, emotionally, or mentally abused by a partner. If you look in if you have an opportunity to read the report, you will see the sources of this data and the studies from which we have pulled this data. But overall, the absence of data on intimate partner violence in the LGBTQ+ community contributes to a general lack of attention and focus on the unique intersecting issues that drive this violence and that affect the LGBTQ+ community. So for this study, ECADE set out to examine the extent or the level of IPV in LGBTQ plus relationships. And I'll say here that it is not it is not and was not intended to be a generalized prevalence study. It's an indicative study, and those are the findings that we're presenting today. And we can talk about how the methodology differs and why we call it an indicative study. So we wanted to look at experiences of IPV based on the lived experiences of members of the LGBTQ plus community, to understand some of the coping strategies that have been used by members of the community to cope with the violence, how they've accessed support services and the types of support services that have been sought and received by persons who have experienced IPV. And also we wanted to get a sense of what is the response to the IPV that community members experience in the countries that we have covered. So the countries were, okay, we come to this now when we look at the methodology. So we had a sort of a mixed methods approach, a fairly standard mixed methods approach to collecting this data. So there was a survey of members of the LGBTQ plus community in the OECS, and the OECS islands that were involved were St. Lucia and St. Kitts and Nevis, and Barbados as separate from the OECS. So we did also some focus group discussions, key informant, and individual interviews as well. And of course, the standard document analysis, like a desk review to set the stage and to provide the entry points for the actual collection of the primary data. So I'm going to look at the findings across these sort of 6 categories. So we're first, just to share with you some details about the socio-demographic features or characteristics of the response of the respondents, relationship status and history, the actual experiences with intimate partner violence, what sort of help-seeking behaviors or coping strategies that they employed once they had experienced the violence. What were their own attitudes towards IPV? And this is this other section 6, IPV recovery and healing, is a very important section, and it's also it was something that ECADE felt was very important to put in the study, because we can't just talk about the trauma. We also have to have something that speaks about recovery and healing and, you know, beyond the standard service help-seeking behaviors. But how else did you, what other strategies were used to help you to recover and heal? So, all right, so the socio-demographic characteristics, as I said, it was 3 countries, Barbados, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Lucia. And you can see here the distribution of the respondents, where almost half of our respondents came from Barbados, 25% from St. Kitts and Nevis, and another almost 22% from St. Lucia. In fact, it was more than half from Barbados. So in terms of the gender identity of the respondents, 44% identified as men, 43.5% as women, and this included 3% who identified as trans women, 10%, 11%, let us say, identified as non-binary, and 1% had other as their gender identity, but this was not stated in the responses. For sexual orientation, more than a third, 35% identified as gay, 24% as bisexual, and 19% identified as lesbians. We had a group of respondents who identified as heterosexual, which may seem a little counterintuitive in this particular study, since we're looking at since we're looking at the LGBTQ plus community. But as we discussed in the team, we recognize that this is how this was a sexual orientation and not the sexual orientation and not the sex identity, if you understand. So when we drill down in this, we found that the majority of those who identified as heterosexual were in fact also identified as women. And of course, we know that the biological, when we use these terms in this context, we're not speaking about biological sex, we're speaking about gender identity. So less than 10% of the survey respondents identified as queer, pansexual, aromantic, and asexual, and gender fluid. So we had about 10% in all in those other categories. It was a very youthful, if you wish, demographic, with over half of the respondents were between 18 and 30 years, and only 6.5% were 51 and above. In terms of education, again, sort of leaning a particular, what's the word I want? Sway, if you wish, for those who had a post-secondary education. And so we had a fairly well-educated population as the respondents. 80% had completed post-secondary. 54% had completed some level of higher education at the university level. And among those, 54% had completed some higher education at the university level. So, and across the genders, all the genders represented had at least one respondent who had completed some level of higher education. Again, a preponderance of respondents, 80%, were working at the time of when we conducted the survey. Only women and men, people who identified as women and men reported being currently unemployed. But then again, that was also the majority of the sample. The highest rate of unemployment was among women, which of course is a constant feature of the labor market in the Caribbean. We're at highest rates of unemployment almost always among women. Non-binary respondents were the most likely to report being unable to work. And by sexual orientation, unemployment rates were highest among lesbians. Of course, that is consistent with the highest rates of unemployment being among women. So for lesbians who identified as women, that would be very consistent. So we asked how open respondents were about their LGBTQ plus status, and more than half had been open with persons close to them, and 42% reported being open with everyone. So in other words, we found that the majority, by far, had been open about their sexuality, and only 6.2% reported that they had not disclosed their sexuality status, if we wish, to anyone, and had remained closeted, so to speak. So there was, well, we can discuss it. Let me not bring my commentary yet. So of those who had not disclosed, 60% were gay. It's a small number we're talking about, and 40% lesbians. So most respondents had disclosed their sexual orientation. Most of the respondents who disclosed identified as bisexuals or gay, and lesbians and heterosexuals Again, we talk about what that means in this context, were found to be the most open. So we wanted to find out something about the overall living conditions of our respondents. So we asked them things about, their housing situation and that sort of thing. So the majority lived with family or family members. Only 20% reported that they lived with a partner. Others lived alone or lived with friends. And then you had this very small number who lived between their partners and their families. So they were, I wouldn't call them nomadic, but they had more than one residence. And again, because we wanted to find out about their socioeconomic situation and their living conditions, we asked about homelessness. And nobody reported that they were living in a shelter or they were living in any sort of transitional housing. But 37% reported that they had at some point in their lives experienced homelessness or unstable housing. And the 40% of those who had experienced this were women. And again, bisexuals were most of the respondents who had experienced some sort of homelessness or unstable housing. 30% were quite young, between the ages of 18 and 25. And another 32% were between the ages of 26 and 30. Almost all, 94%, had been in some sort of intimate partner relationship. And 54% were in a current intimate partner relationship. And then we had others who didn't state their current relationship status, and consistent with the 54% who were currently in a partnership, 44% reported that they were not currently in an intimate partner relationship, although obviously they had been in one before. The majority of respondents said that they were in committed relationships. And then the others variously described the current status with their partner as being complicated, monogamous, open, distant, or polyamorous. And you will note that even with these other descriptions, there is an intersection with the committed relationship. So you can be in a committed relationship that's complicated, that sort of thing. And 58% said that they were with their current partners for 5 years or less. And over 5% had been with their partner for more than 10 years. So the long-term relationships, if you call 10 years, if you use that as the outer band, was few. Most people, as we said before, did not live with their partners, and they also reported not having had a residential relationship with any previous partner. And so we find that most persons were either not in a current relationship, but that was a small amount, or they were not cohabiting. So we look at some partner behaviors. One of the sort of standard approaches to understanding intimate partner violence is looking at whether there are things that we can associate with abusive behavior or experiences of violence. So they're not causes. At best, they're triggers. And so we looked at some of these triggers, which is the language we would use in this kind of research. So something like smoking weed on a daily basis was the most common reported partner behavior. Having multiple relationships or sexual partners, gambling, drinking alcohol daily, or using hard drugs. so we explore these because one of the things you find when you look at intimate partner violence in heterosexual relationships is that women who have partners who well, there are some other questions, but who have multiple relationships or sexual partners are more likely to experience IPV than women who don't have partners who are engaged in these behaviors. So this is part of the reason. I think Lucien is telling me something. I got it. Why? So women were most likely to report that their partner did some of these things, that they smoked weed. And men, though, were most likely to report that their partner had multiple sexual relationships. And 60% of men from that small group and 40% of those who drank daily. And only non-binary respondents reported that their partners used drugs daily. And this was a very small, as I will always say, portion. So when we talk about controlling behaviors, which are a key indicator, like a red flag, if you wish, for intimate partner violence, we see that 36% reported that they had been subjected to at least one form of controlling behavior by a partner. More men reported that they were subjected to at least one form of controlling behavior by the partner. Young, again, the biggest group, it's not the majority, obviously, were those 26 to 30 years. And lesbian respondents, a third of them, and bisexual respondents, another third, were most likely to have experienced controlling behaviors. So let us get now to the actual experiences of intimate partner violence. Half, that is 1 in 2 persons who identified as a sexual minority, if you wish, and have experienced at least one form of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Emotional and financial abuse was the most common form of IPV. This is important because what it is saying is that it was not physical or sexual abuse that was the most common form. So if we break it out, we see that a half have reported having experienced emotional abuse, which is very consistent with IPV data in other target populations. And this emotional abuse includes things like being called names to make them feel bad about themselves or being insulted, particularly in front of others. And we have here just a little over 1/5 reporting that they have experienced some type of financial abuse. And that took the form of involving destruction or damage to their possessions or property. That was what the data told us. And we see that respondents had experienced repeated emotional and financial abuse. And one of the things we asked in this survey, which is standard, is if this had occurred in the last 12 months or if it had occurred over a longer period. So, and again, we saw the breakdown of the demographic. People who identified as men and women were most likely to experience that, and the age. Physical abuse, 30% of the respondents reported experiencing some form of physical abuse. And the most common form of physical abusive behaviors were being pushed or shoved or being pulled by the hair. And 3/4 of respondents who experienced physical abuse, that was the action, that was the abusive behavior, being slapped or had something thrown in the general direction to cause hurt, being hit with a fist or another item to cause hurt. So those were the most prevalent types of physical abuse among the 30% who experienced any kind of abuse. we asked if this abuse was perpetrated by a current partner or previous partner. And overwhelmingly, they said it was experienced by, it was perpetrated by a previous partner. 19% of currently partnered had survived physical abuse, and 20 of those currently partnered. So you have another group of those who are not currently in relationships who themselves had also experienced physical abuse. 25% of currently partnered identified their current partner as the person responsible for the abuse they experience. And this is important because it tells you about people who the experience is a continuing experience. It's their current experience. So they're living with the abuse now. And women were most likely to report that they have experienced physical abuse. And most survivors were had identified as lesbian, the single largest category. And in terms of sexual abuse, 30%, 3 in 10 reported, and sexual abuse. And sexual abuse in this survey, as in, you know, a lot of the surveys, most of the surveys on IPV has a broad definition. So it includes things like sexual coercion, and that is having someone perform a sex act against their will, sexual humiliation or degradation, and those were the most common form of sexual abuse reported here. And we have another group of respondents, almost 38%, who had experienced sexual abuse, and they reported that they felt pressure to have sex with their partner because they were afraid of being hurt or harmed in any other way. And that, of course, is a form of sexual abuse. And again, these things were most likely to happen in previous relationships. Only 14% identified their current partner as the person who's responsible for the abuse they had experienced. And women, again, most likely to have experienced this sort of sexual violence compared to men and non-binary respondents. And the difference here is that most survivors of sexual violence, the single largest group, were those who identified as bisexual. And then we looked at stalking. Let me just check. I think Lucien is indicating that I need to put another clip. But anyway, so we looked at stalking, and this is what we found for stalking, because of course, that is an important aspect of intimate partner intimidation and emotional abuse and so on, right? So if we want to look at the impact, 3 in 10 survivors had sustained actual injuries, because you don't always sustain injuries. They sustain injuries. You have over 50% of those who had experienced violence who required medical attention due to the severity of their injuries. And then 4 in 10 reported that their injuries had led them to miss school or work. I don't want to rush this, because this particular thing, because it is important to know, you know, how people responded to the abuse. And people spoke about it. 6 in 10 who had experienced sexual, well, in this case, they did not tell anyone about the incident. And in other words, they did not speak about it, is really what I meant to say. The 7 in 10 women who reported experiences with physical or sexual partner violence remained silent about it. And 2 in 10 men and 8 in 10 non-binary respondents did not report incidents. Now, I will tell you that this is a departure from what you see in heterosexual relationships. In heterosexual relationships, the prevalence data that we have show women speaking about this violence. So this is very interesting. And we could talk about the stigma and all these other things that might be driving this in the LGBTQ+ community. So for the very small number who spoke, they reported the incident to the police when it was particularly severe. Some confided in their mother, some confided in counselors, and some shared with the healthcare workers. And this type of sharing normally happens when the severity has been ramped up and the abuse is particularly severe. And it's no surprise, therefore, that the majority did not seek any help at all. Right? So of the 20% who sought help, a small proportion of victims sought help from the police, hospital, or medical services, again, speaking to severity, LGBTQ plus organizations, crisis center, the court, and other online support. And when we see these percentages, these could be 1, 2, 3 small numbers of people in the community. And so people said things like they didn't know where to go, or did not think anybody could offer them protection, and that's why they didn't seek help, or they felt ashamed or embarrassed about the abuse they experienced. They feared further abuse. And in some instances, they saw these incidents of violence as normal and not serious, particularly if they were not severe. And about 10% didn't seek help because they feared that they were going to be killed by their partners. But what respondents did was that they made decisions to leave their abusers. And so respondents, 8 in 10 reported that they had left that relationship. And they had left because, and half of those reported that they'd left because they could not endure any more abuse, and that they had left their abuser indefinitely. So they basically took their protection in their own hands rather than seeking help. And then I think we're coming, because when we look at although we're looking at intimate partner violence, we took the opportunity to look at non-partner sexual violence. So we know this is not intimate partner violence, but just to give a sense of other types of violence experienced in the community. And half of the respondents reported that they had been sexually abused by a non-partner. And the most common form of sexual abuse was being forced to have sexual intercourse or being forced to do something sexual that was humiliating or degrading. And about a third of survivors with these experiences identified that the perpetrator was a friend, and not family, but a friend. All right, and then we know that IPV can have a range of impacts, So although some people feel in the focus groups, there was some talk about abuse being just part of a normal relationship, but as in the groups, we found that there were displays of anxious or nervous. People reported feeling anxious or nervous in the presence of their partners, withdrawing from social circles, and basically self-isolating as a result of the abuse, experiencing depression, anxiety, and in some instances, uncharacteristic, as they reported, displays of anger or an irritation, particularly when this whole matter of abuse is brought up by friends or family. And of course, some participants spoke about the impact of manipulation and control by abusive families, to the extent where they had to seek permission even to interact with their friends and family and so on. And then just to look at, just to get a sense of whether people found this to be something that was normal or acceptable, we found that overwhelmingly, respondents rejected the notion that acts of violence were acceptable in a relationship. And they did not agree with the idea that if you didn't fight back, you were in agreement with the with the behavior. And we talked about healing, and they were proud of themselves for gaining freedom, for surviving, for moving on, for being able to create a better quality of life for themselves, having left the abusive relationship, for establishing financial independence. They valued highly the safety and security that they found having left the relationship, and thought they had developed characteristics such as fearlessness. So these were the how they shared that what their resilience looked like. In terms of services, and I'm going to just sort of clip through these and we can speak about it in the discussion. For most respondents, they thought it was very important for institutions and service providers to offer ongoing access to counseling and mental health services. And if you think about the fact that the most prevalent form of abuse that we identified was emotional abuse, it's not, that makes perfectly good sense. But also any kind of abuse and trauma will require counseling and mental health services. Some people felt that it was important to have access to places of safety or shelters or some sort of confidential crisis hotline where they can report the abuse. And they had a lot of concerns regarding confidentiality and disclosure of their reports, and identified that as some of the barriers to reporting. And this whole matter of right to privacy came up repeatedly. So basically, to wrap up, this is just a sort of, summary of the things that we found. We would say that IPV within the LGBTQ+ community is widespread, certainly on par or a little above what the experiences in heterosexual community, in the heterosexual community. And again, this is just a recap of what the data showed us. But there's a high level of distrust and lack of confidence in support services. And we consider that this is an indication of the failure of the state to provide adequate measures that respect the rights of community members and provide equal protection for all. There's definitely, this is like a scratching of the surface, I would say, and there's definitely need to improve data collection, analysis, research, and knowledge about the root causes and experiences of IPV among sexual and gender minorities in same-sex relationships. Thank you. I hope I didn't go over too much, Janash.
Thanks so much, Carol, for sharing that invaluable information. We'll have a good discussion, but just before we proceed on to Dr. Suddeth, can you share how many persons were sampled and the method of the survey?
I did, let me just check that for you. It was an online survey, let me say that. It was not a face-to-face survey. It was an online survey distributed in the networks of the LGBTQ+ organizations in the 3 islands covered. And we ended up, Lucien, save me. We ended up having, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to put it in the chat. I just need to pick up at my actual,
No problem. Put it in the chat. So we'll move on to Dr. Suddeth.
I think a little over
I have to stop
80% in
sharing.
total. Yeah.
So, say that again. I'm going to tell you.
I think all in all, we may have had a sample size of slightly over 80%, if I remember correct.
I'm going to tell you. It's
But
okay.
remember, it's an indicative research, and it's also, we've used a convenient sampling size.
Right.
For this particular survey. So I think it was a little over 80 in total.
that we ended up with in all, that for analysis.
Okay, great. Thank you. So in the interest of time, we'll just quickly move on to Dr. Suddeth. Thank you.
'85.
All right, good morning, good afternoon. Can you hear me all right? Very good. I just want to start by saying thank you for including me in this conversation. I'm delighted to be here, particularly in the company of Carol Watson Williams, whose work I have read and admired for a long time. I am also indebted to Raise Your Voice St. Lucia, where I've done some consulting work for several years, and ECADE, of course. And Dr. Diane Hassania is a co-author on at least one of these studies, but she provided technical support. And I always have to say that I was supported in this work with a Fulbright traditional scholarship, so I'm very grateful to have had the funding to do some of this research. I've been working as a consultant for Raise Your Voice for about 8 years. And when we started talking about research, they were interested in some of the patterns of intimate partner violence in St. Lucia specifically, but they very purposefully wanted to include the LGBTQ+ community in the study. So we talked about a probability study, but those types of studies tend to underrepresent the LGBTQ+ community. So in conversation with ECADE, we decided to do 2 studies, and I'm going to talk about both of them briefly today. I'm going to go through it kind of fast, so I'm happy to answer any questions that you think I'm not covering in the discussion section. The first one was in 2020. It was an online study, and we were looking to compare sexual minority experiences of intimate partner violence with a heterosexual sample. All the research, of course, was online that year, and there were many studies targeting the LGBTQ+ community in the Caribbean. And so I think even though we had the survey open for 5 weeks or so, and we ended up reaching out to the entire Eastern Caribbean to try to get a good sample, we got 58 responses, so a little bit less than your survey and that you mentioned. 52 of those had been in an intimate relationship. So everything I'm going to talk about is going to be based on those 52 individuals. Most of them were female. I think only 14% were male. So when we looked at this, we thought this is exploratory. It's a pilot study. It's as you said in the beginning of your presentation, I'm not sure how representative it is, although you might see some similarities in some of the patterns. But we wanted to know, what can we learn from this? Because again, we were planning to do a second study in St. Lucia. So we put together a survey that's probably fairly similar to the questions that you asked in your survey. So based on the conflict tactics scale, the World Health Organization, a sexual experiences survey, and we were somewhat aware of some of the weaknesses of online surveys, that sometimes they tend to draw people who have, an agenda in terms of filling out the survey, some selection bias. But we were still very interested in trying to see if there was any difference between the heterosexual percentages, or percentages of heterosexual participants in the LGBTQ+ community. In some of the research worldwide, those percentages are the same. In some, the LGBTQ plus community has a higher percentage of participants who have experienced intimate partner violence, particularly among younger sexual minority communities. There may be a higher level of intimate partner violence. And then if you compare lesbians and heterosexual women, oftentimes lesbians have less experience of intimate partner violence than heterosexual women. So we were very interested to see how this would turn out. I'm just going to focus on the results here. And again, I'm happy to talk about some of the demographics. We did get about half the sample were heterosexual, and the other half identified as LGBTQ+, mostly lesbian, gay, bisexual, or queer. What you see here is a bar graph of comparing those two groups, heterosexual and lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer. The far left is any violence. And then we looked specifically at physical violence. The third bar graph there is verbal violence or verbal abuse. And then the fourth is controlling behaviors. And it looks like the LGBTQ community, that a slightly higher percentage of them experience these behaviors, but statistically, we found no difference. Right? A larger sample may find something different. That's possible, and I'm open to that, but that's what we found. So some of the other patterns we saw, besides that, there's no statistical difference in patterns of intimate partner violence between heterosexual and sexual minorities. In addition to that, participants 26 to 40 years old had the highest rates of intimate partner violence, particularly among sexual minorities. That made sense to me. These are the participants who are most likely to be in an intimate partner relationship. And I think we speculated about how coming out, the coming out process might increase vulnerability to intimate partner violence. Among LGBTQ participants, males actually had a higher rate of physical and verbal violence compared to females, but the numbers were, as I recall, very small. There were only 14% of small samples. So again, a larger sample may provide different results. However, I think there's a story there. I was very taken with some of the data around male victimization. I think it'd be interesting to see a comparison between gay men, bisexual men, queer men, as compared to heterosexual men in terms of victimization. That would be one suggestion for future research. The second study was in 2021, and it was on the ground survey. This was a study with a small crew of trained volunteers from Raise Your Voice St. Lucia. And if you'll notice in the pictures, we are clearly identified as working with Raise Your Voice St. Lucia. We always wore some kind of t-shirt with Raise Your Voice on it when we were doing the survey. To get at these participants, we randomly selected neighborhoods in St. Lucia, in the central part of St. Lucia. And then we essentially went door to door, like the census, asking for participation. And we were able to speak with 241 women, a 41% response rate, which I thought was quite decent under the circumstances. And it varied by neighborhood. Some neighborhoods more participatory than others, but overall a very acceptable response rate. We did ask about sexual orientation, and I'll show those results in just a minute. We asked many of the same questions that we had asked online about intimate partner violence experiences. We also asked them who they disclosed to. So very similar to your work in terms of sharing, who did you share with? Of these women, a little over 59% had experienced at least one incident of physical, sexual, emotional abuse, or controlling behaviors. In the past 12 months, 1 out of 4 had experienced some type of intimate partner violence. Was the overall research. In terms of sexual orientation, this is what we're looking at, and this is what I was talking about in terms of probability samples. The column in the middle is the total sample. It's 238 women. We had to remove 3 of them because their memory was such that ethically we could not include their accounts of their experiences. But out of those 238, 79% identified as heterosexual, 2.2% identified as gay or lesbian, 3.6% identified as bisexual, and then 15.2% were in this other category. Some of those who identified as other may have been uncomfortable labeling themselves in the way that they wanted to. Some of them preferred not to be labeled, and so that was the category they chose. And then there were some women who were uncomfortable with the question and really didn't want to have anything to do with that and just said other. So it's a kind of a catch-all category. The percentage who are gay or lesbian or bisexual is very small. So it's difficult to do any kind of analysis with such small numbers. It tends to distort significance tests. You'll notice, however, something that I was interested in was that of those who had experienced intimate partner violence, there's not a whole lot of difference in the percentages who are gay or lesbian or bisexual. So again, I'm not detecting difference. I'm actually detecting similarities in experience that, what I might say is that the gay, lesbian, and bisexual participants had about the same, basically had the same odds of having an intimate partner violence experience as heterosexuals. I'm not seeing the difference there. Now, in terms of who they disclosed to, 73% disclosed to someone. And worldwide, my understanding is that that's very common, that usually you tell someone, even if it's a friend, a sister, someone, you talk to someone. So that wasn't that surprising. Most of them were friends or family that they spoke to. So 65% reached out to informal sources of support. To my surprise, 1 out of 3 reported to the police. That seemed like a very high percentage, but it may be part of the selection bias of this particular sample, that we got people who had already spoken about it, already talked about it. 24% disclosed to medical staff, 20% disclosed to a counselor, and 13% went through family court. Now, as I'm a criminologist, I was interested in this disclosure to the police. I thought that was very interesting. So for the sake of this presentation, I divided into heterosexual and LGBTQ respondents. And what I found is that of those heterosexual IPV survivors, who reported to the police, 68% said the police were supportive. Among the LGBT IPV survivors, in other words, among the lesbian, gay, bisexual survivors of intimate partner violence who did report to the police, all of them said that the police response was either ambivalent or unsupportive. I think in another study I read, the LGBT survivors of intimate partner violence, none of them had reported to the police. So I think there's something there that we could either do more research on or think about in terms of advocacy and education for frontline workers, that despite the fact that the lesbian, gay, bisexual experience is pretty much the same in terms of our study, in terms of comparison to heterosexuals, intimate partner violence, their experience with the police is different. Their experience in reaching out may be different. Now, I did look at predictors. This is a more recent use of this data. I did look at predictors of formal disclosure, like at what point do survivors in St. Lucia reach out to police, healthcare providers, counselors, or social workers? And I found that one of the predictors was severity of violence. In other words, that as the severity of the violence goes up, I think I actually counted the number of violent incidents an individual would have. As that number goes up, they're more likely to reach out formally. And that makes perfect sense. But keep in mind, the percentage of lesbians, gay, and bisexual women who had experienced violence was pretty much the same. So that's probably not going to be a distinguishing factor, right? That severity of violence is one of the drivers of reaching out for formal services. The second factor is informal disclosure. That is, as you tell family and friends, you're more likely to reach out to formal sources of support, right? In other words, it's important to have that social support in order to go to the next step, which is talking about this to the police or to healthcare providers, counselors, or social workers. That's where you might find, I don't have the numbers to do much more analysis on that, but that's where I think you might find more differences in the experience of the lesbian, gay, and bisexual women, possibly sexual minority men as well, that in order to informally disclose that you're experiencing violence from a same-sex partner, you have to be out to your family. And then you have to be comfortable moving on to the next step and being out to the police. And it's not clear for me, I don't have the data on that, but it's not clear to me, how that plays out. That might be room for more research there. It may be, again, a point of education, advocacy that we may want to think about. So in conclusion, what I find here is that no statistical difference in the percentages of heterosexual and LGBTQ+ populations in the Eastern Caribbean or in St. Lucia in IPV experience. More research needed to understand patterns of male victimization in the LGBTQ+ community. Disclosure to police results in less support for lesbian, gay, and bisexual women, at least in this study. And it is a very small group of people that we're talking about, but I thought the patterns were interesting. And disclosure is driven by severity of violence and informal disclosure. Those two things were the biggest predictors, the most significant predictors of reaching out more formally. So I think more research is needed to understand how this interacts with lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, plus women and men, trying to move through that process. And as you say, move to resilience as they reach out for services and move on. So with that, I will hand it over to the facilitator. I'm happy to answer questions as they come up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suddeth, for sharing that much needed research with us. Yes, I'll definitely look forward to the questions that come from it, but we're going to move on to our panel discussion, which in the interest of time, and because we're a little bit behind time, I'm going to have to cut down just a little bit. But first, I'll introduce you to our two additional panelists. The first is Marlene Hewitt, who has a long history of civil society and NGO work, and through the Business and Professional Women's Club of Barbados, plays a major part in bringing about equality, empowerment, and social justice for women. BPW runs the Crisis Center and Hotline, which offers counseling in domestic violence, sexual assault, and suicide, as well as operates a shelter for battered women and trafficking victims in Barbados. Ms. Hewitt is presently the president of the organization, but also under the National HIV Coordinating Agency, has conceived and planned HIV programs for the public and private agencies in order to educate and bring about awareness on stigma and discrimination. She's the proud creative mind behind the play and award-winning film and radio drama titled Simone's Place, and a second play titled Apparent. Both plays address LGBTQ+, HIV, and gender violence issues. As a result of her work, she's identified by the media and the public as a voice for women and marginalized minorities. Marlene continues to focus her energies on making life better for everyone right here, right now. Our second panelist is Catherine Sealys, who is the co-founder and president of Raise Your Voice St. Lucia. Over the last 12 years, Raise Your Voice has been the only vocal and visible NGO advocating publicly on issues affecting marginalized and vulnerable women and children in St. Lucia. Catherine is the voice and passion behind Raise Your Voice, who not only advocates for women and children, but ensures they receive the necessary support services and be reintegrated into society as independent, productive individuals. Thank you, Marlene and Catherine, for joining us. And I think so. We've heard some of not great statistics when it comes to IPV, as in it seems to be just as common amongst the queer community as heterosexual populations. So I'm gonna try to shift the focus a little bit and ask you if you can share some examples of resilience and community empowerment within the queer community regarding IPV survivors.
Is that a question for me, Natasha?
Yes, please. So Catherine and Marlene, you can answer first, and then of course, Dr. Suddeth and Carol can jump in as well.
Oh, okay then, thanks. Instances of resilience among the LGBTQI community after IPV?
Yes, please.
Okay. So there's some background noise because I had to move away from the office. Today's a counseling day, so therefore I couldn't stay there. In our work, we've worked with quite a number of people who are from the LGBTQ community, specifically women, and we've worked with them. And I can say that working with members of the LGBTQI community who are victims or perpetrators of intimate partner violence was a real lesson for us, in the sense that we usually look at, if we're working with heterosexual people, we probably work with the women and not the men. Not that we have not come to the realization that the men need rehabilitation, because sometimes we work with one woman, down the road we work with another woman and it's the same man. But working with the LGBTQI community, we recognize their vulnerabilities, so we work with both parties, not together. And we don't promote reconciliation or anything like that, but we work to rehabilitate both of them. And I can say that it is a lot tougher working with an LGBTQI couple, especially knowing that we're providing services to both of them, than working with a heterosexual, maybe just a woman. This has caused us to amend the way we work with them. And so we had to assign them to separate counselors, not see the same counselor, because at one time we only had one counselor. Even if we never do any disclosure, we felt it was a problem. But we have to say, after working with a same-sex couple, specifically women, and you work with them and they come to the realization that the relationship is probably incompatible, it's not going to fix itself the way you expect. We find that they move on. They don't move on right away, but when they move on, they really do move on, and they really do not come back like normal couples do, and come back and tell you, well, they went back and the relationship went to the same place again. They don't go back to the same relationship. They always very, very, very wary of going back to the same relationship. So there is some resilience in the LGBTQ community that we are not seeing in women, that we're trying to work on. Women in LGBTQI community in St. Lucia, especially the lesbian women, sometimes the relationship is tough. They have children, they don't want their family to know, but they have a partner, they're in a relationship with somebody, and sometimes it takes a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity in order to get them to realize you have to come to terms with who and what you are, or you have to continue. You have to make a choice. You cannot have it both ways. You have to determine that this is who I am and this is who I'm going to be. It is it is always something we up to yesterday we were working on a case like that, that they seem to think that the way they can survive, avoid victimization, stigmatization, and whatnot, is by being in a regular relationship, but also that is not what their choice, but being in a secret relationship. And this creates a lot of complications for both us, our counselors, our volunteers. But when they do move on, they really do move on, and they make a decision and they move on. And this is something that we always look at and say we wish it was like that with women all the time, because it's like they cannot make a decision. They feel, now that I have done that, maybe the person has changed, I am going to go back to this relationship because the person realized I am not going to stand for that. It never works that way. But we continue to learn lessons from our work. We continue to use the lessons learned, and hopefully we continue to have better results.
Thank you, Catherine. That's fascinating. I think that's another area for research that we could probably look into, like what are some of the factors that make LGBTQ plus people better able to move on when they decide to, make that severance. Marlene?
Thank you. I'm sorry my camera is not working. One of the things that we've been able to observe is that some of the members of the community, in order to move on, they then form attachments with groups that we have in Barbados. So some of them will go to Equals, some to Seed, where the groups provide psychological counseling for them. And that allows them to move from the place that they are to another place. Also, for the women, I think they are in a better place in that they have access to our safe house. And they will call when it becomes pretty serious, they will call and they will come into, if it is a case where they fear for their life or it's become very aggressive, they will come into the safe house, and there they will achieve some measure of more confidence and control over their life in order to be able to move on. And we find that when they do leave the house, they don't go back to the perpetrator. They will set up mostly on their own and start to rebuild their lives. Another area I found is that some members of the community are willing to work with the police and the paramilitary group, and that allows them to interact with these groups and see a different way of moving on. They'll talk to them and realize maybe that the paramilitary groups or the police are not as blind to their suffering as they thought at first. And that allows them to be able to start to work on themselves more. They've actually admitted that they were seeing it in a different way, and having met with these organizations, we've had workshops for over a week in some cases, and that constant interaction have allowed them to see things differently and to make some moves to move on with their lives and to support others. So I would think that's some of the areas that we see.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Catherine. I think you've just started providing some of the answers to what Catherine was, Marlene, sorry, to what Catherine was raising. Any input that Carol or Laurie want to add to this before I ask another question?
If I may, because it's very interesting to hear both ladies speak about the sort of ability to move on from these relationships. Because it is one of the things that we found in our study that the respondents had basically left the abusive relationships. And they hadn't left it and gone back. They had left indefinitely. They had moved on from those relationships. So it's good to hear that the evidence on the ground mirrors in some way the data that we collected.
And I would just add, I was just thinking as you all were talking that for heterosexual women, there's a lot of support to stay in the relationship. There's a lot of support to be married and be in a relationship. Whereas for lesbians and women who are identified with other women, the challenge is to stay in the relationship. So when you're pulled apart like that, when you move on, I think there's a cultural context there that's very interesting and certainly worth thinking about in terms of research.
That is so true. Great insights.
If I may,
Yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting because it is right. There's this cultural context and there's this pressure on women to stay in these heterosexual relationships, particularly given the fact that heterosexual women are more likely to informally disclose the abuse. So they're being counseled into remaining in the relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. I think we've had some questions, some answers to this. So like in Carol's presentation, coming on to the end, we've had some hints of what allies and advocates from both within and outside the LGBTQ plus community can do to support and support survivors and address IPV. But let's kind of like outline it better, be more precise and identify some specific things that we can do to support survivors and address IPV. So this is for everyone. And maybe we can start with Marlene.
Yes, one of the things that we definitely need is a safe space for men. Not necessarily a shelter per se, but there should be somewhere where men can go, especially if the abuse is very severe, where they can get away from the perpetrator and know that there are people there who can support them and surround them, give them a quiet moment to be able to think about how they move on from that situation. The women, because we have a safe house, they can go, but the men don't have a space. And that may be one of the things that the organizations from the community can start discussing, having a safe space, even if it's in someone's private residence.
So we do have safe space, but it's, in our experience, it has been extremely, it has been more difficult to get lesbian women into the safe space than men, than gay men. For example, two gay men in a relationship, in an abusive relationship, is also very physical and sometimes very dangerous. And they are always ready to go back and fight because you said something and you met somebody and the person said something. The women are more likely to try and get away from it, don't speak about it in public, and don't go on a full-scale public war. So we offer safe spaces, but not safe spaces just for you to think about things. We offer safe spaces if we feel that you need a place to stay, number one. Number two, and if you feel that you are in danger and you need to be in a safe space. And over the years, we continue to evolve and try to do things try to do things better. We have not had a situation where we worked with some people from the LGBTQI community, and that they did not come out of the process, having learned how to cope with a number of issues, because sometimes the relationship is, people may think the relationship is the problem. Sometimes the relationship is not the problem. The problem is dealing with all the things in your environment, in your ecosystem. You have to deal with at work. Sometimes at work, you don't want people to know you're in a same-sex relationship because they may decide that they're going to stigmatize you. You don't want your landlord to know. So when if the landlord happened to see you walking into holding hands, and they want to know. A couple of weeks ago, we had a case where in the middle of the storm, a landlord in Viewfort decided to evict the client because they had been living together, but maybe she thought they were roommates, and then she saw them in town holding hands at the supermarket. So that was something else. She asked them to leave, and she asked them to leave immediately and call the police. And it was a whole thing. Now, it's not that they as a couple could not stand their ground, because clearly the law states that you have to give the person formal notice and you have to give them 90 days to get a place to stay. But they also don't want, like, my business, how dare everybody, the woman talking loud, so I'm just going to go. So sometimes this is the cause of the homelessness that we see, because they live in haste without having identified another place to go. And it is always, you're always trying to balance, am I wrong? Am I right? Am I doing the right thing? People judging me, so I don't want people to know who I am. So you balancing a second life, so to speak. So it's always very stressful. It's always something that you're trying to maintain two personalities. Sometimes I say that. And we always try to tell people, if this is who you are, then you need to accept yourself first. When you accept yourself, then maybe people begin to accept you. Because if you're hiding away from your own self, how are people going to accept you, because you have not accepted yourself? So this is one of the trainings we do, is about self-acceptance. The other thing we do is, as a rule, you must have 2 sessions with the counselor every week. If you cannot manage 2, 1, but you must, because we feel it grounds you, and it gives you coping mechanisms so that you can deal with your environment, you can deal with the various issues that come with. We also try to remove a lot of the burden. So, rent is a burden, we'll take care of that. Food is a burden, you can just collect food. You need to go to the doctor. We'll send you to a private doctor. We'll not send you to the public hospital, because the public hospital, you sit and wait. People, you sit in the waiting room, people making comments at you, people look at you funny, people say things so that you can hear to destabilize your mind. So we try to do things that keep people safe, number one, and try and get them through the process as seamless as possible, and don't create additional traumas because they have to be dealing with the general public. So these are some of the things that we do, and we hope that it is something that we can begin to pilot across the region, providing safe space for counseling, for people to get food, their medication and whatnot. There were quite a few of them. I don't know what has been the problem. STD is a thing, not in only in the LGBTQI community, but generally in St. Lucia, I don't know what has happened. So we try not to put people through the embarrassment of going to the public clinic. Everybody want to know what you're going to do there, because government have a STD clinic. We send you to the private doctor so that you can get treated, and people don't have to know and stuff like that. So these are the little things that we do, and we hope that it makes a difference in everybody's life, including the LGBT community in St. Lucia.
Thanks so much. I think those are some great suggestions, and especially given ideas for organizations and things that they can start working on as well. Carol or Laurie, do you have anything you want to add to specific actions?
I have a particular concern about what we're seeing among young people. And so in the data that we collected, and I saw it again in Laurie's data, we know that this is what happens in the heterosexual couples, in data on IPV and heterosexual relationships. We have a persistent problem about intergenerational transmission of this violence, because young people are also experiencing this violence. And I think that there is definitely scope for more focus on understanding what it is that is causing very young people, even those raised in an atmosphere where there is more strong public outcry against intimate partner violence, but they still somehow manage to become perpetrators and victims of this kind of violence. So I raise it because it strikes me that if we're not seeing reductions down the age range, then we know that we're not making sufficient progress.
Right.
And I think there must be some sort of particular focus for young people. In the LGBTQ community, the high level of non-disclosure, again, is also a problem. And that is perhaps what is also causing young people to be silent about the violence that they experience, and also perhaps can be triggers of perpetration as well. But I think we need something that focuses on young people, meaning those 30 and under, but that's my definition of young people. And then how we can change patterns in that age group.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out, I agree with all of that. And I think one way that we can be supportive is to think about the places where LGBTQ plus survivors of intimate partner violence would be reporting. Where would they be disclosing? There's one piece of research I remember from years ago that suggested that the more options a survivor has in terms of reporting, the more likely they are to report. So the more training and education we can do for frontline workers who might hear those disclosures, the more awareness we can raise in the general public so that friends and family can be supportive as well, but not only of intimate partner violence, but of identity, being supportive of identity. And I think we've seen in both of our data sets that this is crucial. for resilience.
If I can say something, I agree with Lori. And one of the methods we have taken is not necessarily only working directly with the individual, but the general public. And so that's why we brought out plays. We've also converted the plays into film and into radio dramas. And we are looking that if we can change the public, their view of the LGBT community, then that would allow the individuals to be able to come out easier. So over the last few years, we've been lucky in that we've been able to show the films, we've been able to have the radio dramas on 2 of the radio stations, and we continue to try to have them bring it over more. Actually, once in about 2 years ago, it came on Valentine's Day, and that really surprised me. And it ran for 8 days. So I think that if we can do more for the public themselves and families, and we discuss everything within those plays and films, and almost everyone within all the actors are either from the community. I think there was only one person who was allegedly straight, and we delve into all the issues. Maybe the person is out, maybe they're not out, somebody else is not out but is very masculine and has all these thoughts and wondering why I have those thoughts and is thinking of committing suicide. So we address a lot of areas, address family violence. Person gets a black eye from the father because they told the father, mother puts them out, all these different things. And I think if we could maybe have more people bringing out cultural programs that speaks to this may be a way to influence the public.
Thank you. Thanks, Marlene. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to all of our panelists. We have gone over time, but I can do a quick 5 minutes for questions, burning questions from the audience. You can raise your hands or you can put it in the chat. We already have Zahida in the chat who said that they're attending from South Africa, and they have a serious issue with IPV there and a lack of data. I'm wanting to know if they're optimistic for collaboration in addressing that.
Is that in the community itself or just generally?
The IPV?
Yes.
I think it's in the community itself, as in LGBTQ+, yeah.
I would be willing to have maybe a chat with them.
Okay, great. Well, I think if you look in the chat, yes, there's an email address. So you can all get in contact, including the ECADE and the researchers as well. Any other questions?
So I don't have a question, but I have a comment, Natisha.
Sure.
So in 2020, and that was, sorry about that, in the height of COVID, we did this perception survey just for students 10 to 19 about domestic violence, and we realized that they are not informed, they are not educated, and not only the students are not, the teachers are not. And there is a significant problem in the sense that if we say we want to do a program in the schools about sexual and reproductive health, domestic violence, consent, respect, and stuff like that, and the teachers would immediately migrate about, they want to teach the children about sex, they want to teach them about same-sex relationships. So you have this as a barrier. And we feel in St. Lucia, the biggest catchment of young people are in the schools. We have about 46,000 students on island. And I believe is the possessiveness of the Ministry of Education not to allow people in to actually inform and educate both students and teachers play a very critical role in how they become aware. That is a problem. We were doing a project with UN Women under the Spotlight program where we were training frontline social services agency people about the new Domestic Violence Act. And then we decided we were going to invite 100 students one day, just on their own with their counselors, to do a training. And they were extremely interested in the information that was being shared, but imagine the school counselors, which I think at the time we probably had about 9 or 10 of them in the room, and they were not sufficiently educated so that they self can guide young people. When there is violence in the school, even if it is the beginning of a intimate partner domestic relationship, they put it down to the student. They're young, they just fussy, and they're just aggressive, and they just think. But we see people migrating from the school in Form 5, going to South Louis Community College, being very aggressive, being very possessive, being very dominant of their partner. And we see it migrate out of the school system into full-blown domestic violence and intimate partner violence. So our challenge is, how do we convince the Ministry of Education that it's necessary to educate both the teachers and the students on recognizing the signs of intimate partner violence, identifying, and what can they do about it? That is our challenge, and we've been working on that for years. It's just not a regular thought. But the teachers, it's like a fortress in there when you speak about things like domestic violence, things like sexual and reproductive health, and what have you.
Thanks, Catherine. That is true. That's a challenge with a lot of things when it comes to the Ministry of Education. So I think Maria wants to say something, and then I'm gonna ask Ray to ask their question, and that will be the end of the question and answer segment. So all we have time for.
Yes, good morning, everybody, and good to see the uptick of the panel. For those who are interested in the full report, I just wanted to point out that it is now on ECADE's website. It's on the resources tab. You click on the resources on the right side of the screen, and under there you will see among the different menu items, research and publications, and you'll find the report as well as other reports that ECADE has done under that tab. So you can have a look at it, you can download it and read it thoroughly for yourself. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Ray, do you want to unmute and ask your question, or do you want me to read it?
Okay, hi everyone, good evening. I want to just ask it quickly. So I'm curious to know whether or not this research that you all did, if it shed any light on how gender norms and practices actually influence or interact with domestic violence among queer couples. And the second thing is that during this research, are there any limitations you observed in the study that you think are important next steps to do further research on in understanding and addressing same-sex intimacy?
I think that the main limitation for us was the numbers. If you do probability studies, you get smaller numbers of LGBTQ identified participants. But if you reach out purposefully, it doesn't have the same generalizability. So looking for ways to enhance the numbers. I love the idea of doing mixed methods. I think Carol is right that the mixed methods not only gives you the patterns, but it helps understand some of the nuances of those patterns. So going forward, I would look for ways to increase the sample size, but also look for ways to use mixed methods to get at a better understanding of those patterns.
Yes, I agree completely with Laurie about the sample size. We definitely need to look at methodologies that can allow us to reach more people in the community. We use, as I said, an online platform to do the survey. And we went back and forth, particularly Lucian and I, just thinking about what this means for the safety of the respondents, because one of the things we realized was that in same-sex relationships, when you're sending out this questionnaire, you really run, you're likely to be sending it out to both parties in the relationship, which, if there's abuse, would increase the likelihood that the abuser would also get the questionnaire. And one of the things about the ethics of doing work on intimate partner violence is really preserving the safety of the respondents. So there was this back and forth. How are we going to make sure that people who are likely to have been victimized are safe? Because then their partner knows about this survey. And then the partner is going to want to know if they disclosed in the survey and that sort of thing. So the whole matter of a methodology that protects the survivors of violence is very important. In heterosexual relationships, there's a methodology because we only speak to women. So that is a very important part of the methodology. In the same-sex relationships, we don't have that particular safeguard. So that becomes a very important thing for us to consider moving forward. But certainly strategies to increase the numbers is very, very important, because the more people we're able to capture in the surveys, the more confidence with which we can speak about the results of the surveys. We're not calling them a pilot, we're not calling them indicative, we're saying this is it. And so we need to be able to look at that. So that's what I have to say for sure. I wanted to, just one thing about the gender norms, and if we had explored how gender norms drive the violence. It wasn't fully explored in the survey that we did, but in the focus groups, there was a lot of discussion around the issue of gender norms.
Awesome. Thank you, Carol. Thanks, Dr. Suddeth, and thanks to everybody in the panel. And thank you all. So I'll hand you over back to Janash, who will wrap up.
Yeah, so I would like to thank all the panelists. Natasha, you did an amazing job moderating this entire webinar and keeping the conversation going and flowing. The study that Carol and Dr. Suddeth did was very eye-opening. I would like to draw attention especially to Carol's study when Carol spoke about the most prevalent form of abuse for LGBTQ persons were financial and emotional abuse. And I think that is very important now, because especially for young people, there's a high rate of mental health, especially within the LGBTQ community. And I do think that all of this is contributing towards it. The fact that with Laurie's research, you can see that there's a high rate of heterosexual persons actually reporting these their cases of IPV to other persons and the police versus persons of the LGBTQ community. And all of that, it's something that we need to really focus on, see why that is the issue. Even maybe a research project can be, we can do a research on that. But again, it was amazing. The data was great from both presenters. Marlene and Catherine, your contributions were amazing as well, especially knowing what on-the-ground support looks like, especially for women. I like the fact that Marlene did mention that men need to create their own safe spaces, and we need to provide safe spaces for men, not only shelters, but resources, access resources that men can, can go to and, have a conversation about that. But overall, this was amazing. It was excellent. I would like to thank our audience for also being very patient with us. I know we didn't start on time, but things happen. The questions were great. And overall, I would just like to say thank you. thank you to everyone. Lucienne, do you have anything to say?
After that, no, Jonas, I just really want to say thank you to everybody. I know it's been a journey for the ECADE Secretariat to get this sort of initiative completed, and we're grateful to Carol for sticking it out with us. There were many moments of learning. Carol mentioned, for example, that the issue around safety, which is ground that still has to be developed, and we're happy to sort of have taken a crack at it. But I think there's more room there to come up with methodologies that do safeguard the safety of survivors of intimate partner violence. We've done sort of this first effort, if you will, to include St. Lucia, Barbados, and St. Kitts and Nevis. But if we have additional resources, perhaps we could extend that to the other countries of the OECS. And beyond, to understand a more wholesome Caribbean perspective. And I do agree with the perspective raised by both Dr. Suddeth and Carol around getting more of our community involved, so that the research is more representative of the actual realities on the ground. We had hoped at some point in the early stages of the research that we could say a bit more, at country level, but we realized that, that wasn't the most conducive way to complete the research in a way that it's still very meaningful. And so we opted for a more sort of multi-country perspective in that regard. So all in all, thank you, and thank you to you, Jonash, for the work that you've done to organize and coordinate this particular event. I really won't take any more time of everybody, and I really thank you for the audience for joining us and for listening in. The research is available for your use, and we're very happy to collaborate. If once people reach out, over to you, Jonash.
Thank you, Lucienne. So that's it from us. I hope everyone have an amazing day, and bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.